Welcome, ladies and gentlemen. Absolutely delighted to have you with us today. And we've got John Hattie with us and Katie from Osiris. And we're going to be looking at what the key priorities are now in terms of looking at strategy. We're in the COVID era. We're going towards the post-COVID era. And this is what John's going to be looking at today with us. Okay, first of all, just introduce Katie.
Hi, everyone. I'm Katie and I'm the Client Relations Director here at Osiris.
And John.
Great to see you too, Stephen and Katie, and all those that are leaders out there in this really eerie time of COVID. I'm sure, like here in Australia, right at the moment, it's a strange world, but it's great to be here.
Fabulous. Well, we're going to get right into the presentation. We're looking at 5 key areas here, and we're going to start off with what it takes to create an impact narrative, because this is a huge area that we're looking at in the UK at the moment. So over to you, John.
Thank you. Well, what I want to talk about in the session, as Stephen said, are these 5 big issues. And I want to start with this question. And my mantra is very much about know thy impact. And of course, that begs that question. What do you mean by impact? And one of the first things that we do when we work with you as schools, and we invite you to do every time you start a new school year, start a new initiative, is have discussions about this concept of impact. If you ask your students about what is the impact that the school is trying to have on them, sometimes it can be a very sobering message. You'd learn very little in terms of their notions of impact. And sadly for them, who are the beneficiaries of all what we're supposed to do, if they don't know what we mean by impact, it makes it a very, very tough notion. And so working together about this notion of impact is so critical. I want to put it in terms of short, medium, and long term. And I want to start with long term. It's probably no surprise that for all of us, that we do want to have an impact on our students' lives, and particularly in terms of their achievement. And we should make no apology for looking at achievement. Without achievement as one of our focuses, seriously, what's the purpose of schooling? But you don't start there necessarily. That's the long-term game. Every school we work with, it usually takes 1 or 2 or 3 years before you start to see changes in maths and reading and social studies, science, etc. We also want to have an impact on their growth. We want every student, no matter where they start, to make at least a year's growth for a year's input. I'm very driven by the notion of whether school is an inviting place for kids to come to. One of the best predictors of adult health, wealth, and happiness is not achievement at school. It's the number of years of schooling. So to what degree is your school an inviting place to kids to want to come back? When you ask 4 and 5-year-olds about do they want to come to this place called school to learn the stuff we teach them at school, 95% plus want to come to school. By the end of primary school, it drops to about 4 out of 10 want to come. 6 out of 10 don't want to be there to do the kind of things that we want them to do. They're happy to come with their friends, they're happy to come for social life, but to study the things that we care. And so if you don't worry about how you increase the number of kids who want to be invited to come to learn, is the school a school of choice for them to want to come? And I do that for the students, not the parents. That's a good thing too. But from the students' point of view, which are going to drive the parents, is this a school they want to come to learn? And do they have multiple learning strategies? We have a lot of discussion about 21st century skills and lifelong learning and capabilities. It is about having strategies to learn, which you learn within the content of the subject. So those are the longer term impacts I want to have. And then I look back to the medium term impacts that I expect to see after 6 months or a year. Do the students actually know what to do when they don't know what to do? If they get something wrong and you get them to talk aloud about how they got something wrong, do they have an alternative strategy? Because if they don't, they're not going to be good learners.
John, could I just come in on that learning strategies, because this is kind of quite a new area really within the UK domain in terms of understanding. What my understanding is that I know your research seemed to indicate about 450 potential learning strategies, but each kid seems to be wired differently with a different combination, and they already have those innately. Is that right?
Well, I'm not sure they have them innately. A lot of kids learn very on. They don't have 480 strategies. Most kids have one. And when it doesn't work, they do it again. And it's having an alternative. And so I'm talking about having a few alternative strategies. So when the first one doesn't work, they have the other. The other thing I'm concerned about is certainly in medium to short term, if I came into your school, Stephen, I would want to be able to take a transcript of the teacher's teaching and ask the question, how many times does a teacher listen to a student thinking aloud about the strategy they use, and or how many times do they teach kids a particular strategy to use? When we did the analysis in the UK a couple of years ago on 17,000 transcripts of lessons, after 5,000 hours of reading them, I gave up. I couldn't find one, zero. So that's what I'm talking about. Listening to the strategies kids use and giving them an alternative when it doesn't work. It's that simple.
So,
I also want to start in medium-term impact to see progress and achievement. And I do want them to have that respect for self and respect for others. That's the essence of classroom climate, is amongst the students as much as it is between you, the teacher, and the students. In the short term, immediately, I want to see what their concept of themselves as a learner is. I want to come into your class and say, who is a good learner? Which kids are the best learners? What does it mean to be good learners? And I want to ask the students that. And I want to ask the teachers that. And sometimes I'll even ask the parents or the parent groups, what do they mean by good learner? And if there is a similar notion, usually in line with what many teachers think, that's a pretty good short-term outcome. Sadly, in the schools we often work with, we ask the students what it means to be a good learner, and they say things like, come to work prepared, come to the class prepared, make sure you work hard, sit up straight, ask questions, and watch the teacher work. And they aren't necessarily the attributes of good learners. Learning's a struggle, learning's hard work, learning's messy, learning requires strategies. And so getting that notion of what it means to be a good learner, and that's when we talk about student voice. But let me be very clear. Student voice about learning. There's too much talk about student, talk about other things. No, it's about learning. Do teachers meet together and talk about what they mean by impact? Do they have a common understanding of what a year's growth looks like? We know the incredible power of teachers' expectations. And if teachers think a year's growth is that, and another teacher thinks it's that, they'll both be successful, sadly, wonderfully. So how do teachers talk about impact? Is, from the student's point of view, do they have a sense of belonging? Is it a safe place for them to say, I don't know? No child comes to your school to learn which they already know. It's what they don't know. And so how do we make that a place? Like when I ask your students for shorter term impact, what do you do when you don't know? Now, the majority of students say the same thing. I put my hand up. Watch them. No, they don't. The only kids who put their hands up are the kids who know the right answer. And so how do you turn that on its head so that this is a place where it's okay to go into the learning pit and not know and not understand? And so my first big message in this session is I would hope that in your school, across your teachers, and in your district, in your trust, in your groups of schools, you have discussions about your concepts of what impact means. And I invite you to do it in terms of short, medium, and longer term impact. And notice what's missing. I don't have outcomes in terms of financial, structural issues, curriculum issues, assessment issues. I have it in terms of the impact on student issues. Now, all those things can obviously impact students, but the outcomes and the impact I want to have is about the students. Of course, then we have to worry about the teacher ones too. Stephen.
It seems like a stupid question, but why are you focusing on learning so much, John? Right? You know, there's not even a mention of teaching there.
No, because I don't care less, Stephen, how teachers teach. I think we've had far too much politics of distraction, talking about teaching methods and how we teach in this school. And I'm a problem-solving school. I'm an inquiry school. Get over it, guys. It doesn't matter how you teach. What I care about is the impact of your teaching. And one of the things you discover is if you ask the question about what is the effect that we have on kids, you don't get necessarily a strong answer about a particular way of teaching. In fact, for many teachers, I want them to be like kids. You asked about learning strategy before. I want them to have multiple teaching strategies so that when the first one doesn't work, they have another strategy that they can try. And so that's why I'm very keen that when we talk about impact, we focus very much on the impact we want to have on students. Like, let's get real. Nearly every one of us came into this profession for one reason: to have an impact on students. All I'm doing is reminding you of that. Those other things we talk about are correlates, they can be causation, and they can be very important. I don't doubt that. But they're not part of what I mean by impact. It is about that impact we have on kids.
Nice. And so then the next question comes, how do we scale this then right across organisations and multiple schools? Because I think this is one of the hardest things, because every school feels that they're a bit of an individual element.
The number of times we are told that my school is unique, my school is different. Actually, if you travel around the world, which I used to do before COVID, and you go to enough schools, you find that the commonality of diversity is the norm. And certainly, when the other part of what I see is that so often in schools, we look for problems and try to fix them. I want to do the opposite. Every school we've ever worked in, there are pockets of excellence. I want the school leaders to have the courage to reliably identify where that excellence is, form a coalition of success around those excellence, and invite those who are not having the same impact to join. That's the upscaling model. The hard thing there, Stephen, is courage. It's so much easier to worry about curriculum and bus timetables and lunch menus and all those other things. It's so much easier to worry about how we teach equity, diversity. Not that they're unimportant. It's so much harder to privilege expertise. And that's the essence of what our profession is. And that's what we want to do. And that's what we do in our visible learning work, is we identify where that excellence is. Now, how do you do it so you don't name and shame? You can't talk to those in school that are not having the high impact as if they're lesser beings, and then the next day expect them to be part of the journey. It doesn't work that way. You've got to help work with them and understand what their conception of excellence is, what their expectations is, what's their notion of a year's growth, and having that conversation, listening to those. Sometimes your 5-year-out veteran has a greater impact. Sorry, your 5-year-out teacher has a greater impact than your 30-year-old veteran. That requires courage. And it requires not leaving both of them behind. And so that's the way to get scaling. And once you get scaling, it becomes a very virtuous circle.
So what we're saying is this language in the narrative actually becomes the language of expertise.
It becomes, this is what's normal in the school. This is what we do in the school. And sometimes those teachers who have been very experienced in your school and who are also having the highest impact can be the most resistant to working collectively. They just want to be left alone to go back to their classroom, close their door, and indulge in their passion. We cannot afford that. We must make sure that we privilege their ways of thinking as well. And so how do you get them part of the solution and get them working with other teachers in their schools, deprivatising the classes, creating opportunities and time within school time for this to happen, and to make sure that what's normal here is we talk about impact.
Great. So should we get on to the upscaling then?
Yes, this is where we want to go in terms of how then we start with looking at those enhanced student outcomes, looking at those short, medium and long-term goals, and then going back to build a program logic. And this is where on the far side, on the far left-hand side, this is where you get your strategies. This is where you get your different teaching methods, your different interventions, your different programs. But the backward design by looking at the notion of impact is the way which you then get scaling. If you work the other way, you want everyone to teach in a particular way, it doesn't scale, for good reason. If you want to have a particular intervention, may not scale. It may not be the right intervention. Sometimes interventions are not related to the problem you're solving, and the problem you're solving is identified by the outcomes. We also want to look at how you build that capability. And the work we do with Osiris is we start with looking at a whole number of dimensions across your school and working with you to identify where, for example, on the traffic light system, what happens in your school in terms of the evidence about the climate, about your planning, your notions of impact, about the feedback that you're receiving as teachers about your impact, and quite a few of the dimensions that we're looking at there to better understand. And not only is this a great diagnosis up front, when you do it later, it becomes an excellent way of monitoring your progress. And that is an incredible way to get scaling up, is when teachers start to see the impact on their students are increasing, then they become wedded to the notion and more involved in the notion. And they stop some of the discussions they had before about how to teach, about students, about curricula, and start talking about impact and how to modify curricula and get more kids involved in the impact.
So what you're doing, John, here is getting away from this kind of perception and digging deeper underneath it and saying, where's that perception coming from? You show us what's actually happening. And the other bit I really like here is that we've got a diagram right at the beginning, which is explaining the strategy and the evaluation model behind it. And really, without that representation, it's quite hard to explain to other people, let alone get them to buy into that. Sorry, 2 bits there, but.
Here's an example. Across our 9,000 educators from 2 years ago, right across the world, including the UK, we did a capability analysis where you start. Now, of course, you're watching this. This may not be your school, but this was the common denominator on a 5-6 point scale about where schools saw themselves. And you look down that, it is about the learning notion. It is about through the eyes of the students. It is about planning together. And so that was a really interesting list for me about what many schools are saying. Now, that may be true in your school. And quite frankly, if you're down that low on those things, you're not going to have the kind of impact that you want to have on students. When I look at one of our biggest problems is the question of readiness. To what degree is your school, your class ready to change what you're doing, to look at an improvement model that's based on the kind of work that we've been doing? And you can see on a 10-point scale here, the average readiness is about 7. Some schools are not ready to go through major improvement cycles. And to get them ready, sometimes you have to do deeper diagnosis to demonstrate that what they see happening in their school is not necessarily what the students see. As I said before, sometimes what the parents see. How then can you get them to go down and look at the quality of implementation? So many programs, including visible learning, can be introduced in a school, but sometimes, particularly through adaptation, schools, teachers, principals adapt the program because they say it has to fit here, and they adapt the innovation, they adapt the essence of the improvement out of it. And so we're very careful at looking and working with you to try and understand how we're actually implementing the model, what's working, what's not working, and making sure we stop what's not working fast, so that we look at what the dosage is, the fidelity is, and the quality. And we're particularly keen about adaptation so that there's not too much adaptation, so get rid of the key notions so you don't go back to what you're doing before, but sufficient to make it a difference. And then when you look at the work we've been doing and saying, well, what's the effect sizes of doing a 1 or 2 year program that has this focus on the language of learning, has this focus on those longer and shorter term outcomes you can point about? And they're quite impressive effect sizes. And this is the change from the initial point that you saw. And so the question is, start backwards. Do you want these kinds of changes and improvement in your school? If you do, then it's that focus on helping teachers see through the eyes of students and helping students see themselves as their own teachers that really makes the difference.
Can I just come in, because you've got the assessment capability there, which I think is absolutely profound in here, but it's a very John language. What do you exactly mean by assessment capability, with it being such a high driver there?
Well, so often when we talk about evidence, we talk about it through the teacher's eyes, and there's nothing wrong with that. Great fan of that. But I want to go that next step. Every time a kid does a piece of work, every time the kid does an assessment or an assignment, we should be able to teach those students how to interpret the feedback and the comments we get them, interpret the grade, so that when they get something back, they don't see it as the work is over, but they see it as an opportunity. And so the notion of making them assessment capable is teaching them how to make those interpretations. Now, it can be very sobering here, Stephen, because sometimes it's a lot of poverty in terms of what they say, which means we haven't got it right, which means we haven't given them the skills. We haven't given them the feedback about where they need to go next. And we haven't given them the kind of teaching that allows them to make those interpretations. And so it's that whole notion that if you are in that learning cycle and you're a learner, you need to have a better understanding of where you started, how you're progressing, where you need to end up with, and what that gap is between where you are and where you need to be up. And that's where assessment capable students are looking for, seeking feedback information to understand better how they can improve to get to success criteria. And that's what we mean by assessment capable. There's our exercises on reading and maths from where we start. So we know when I showed you this was about many attributes of teachers and kids. This now is the attributes in terms of reading and maths and in terms of the perceptions of change and the perceptions of improvement. Upscaling it, you've got to capture the hearts and minds of your educators. There has to be some kind of burning platform. And as I said, that notion of reminding them why they came into the profession. How do we maximize impact? And how do we do it together, collectively? What we do in the school is normal. We walk into each other's classes and no kid blinks. We help the teacher. We don't watch the teacher teach. That's a sin to do that. We help the teacher see their impact by watching the students. We build a coalition around that success. We know at the moment that about 80% of teachers have been teaching in a way that's been around for 150 years. Not such a bad thing. We know about 15% do it quite differently and 5% are quite novel. We want to turn that on its head and say, here, the novel, the focus on the student as the learner, on seeing learning through the eyes of the students, 80% of what happens in the school, that's what happens. That focus on improvement. Goodness gracious, we've had so much change in education. Sometimes change is the problem. It's improvement we want. How we build that incredible strong model of implementation. And we use this notion of the DIE, diagnosis, interventions, implementation, and evaluation. And how we do that collectively and privilege and promote this notion of impact, so all as teachers and students understand what we mean by impact and stop doing that which doesn't serve the above agenda. And this is the notion. I find it fascinating, Stephen, that if you look at the history of education and say, how many articles have ever been written about upscaling and success in education? I'm up to 7. So often we find failure and try and fix it. I want to find success and grow it.
I think also there's been this kind of notion as well of taking from outside, the silver bullet notion. So I think they would call it now. And that's been kind of what would work here should work elsewhere. But this isn't what you're finding. And I think this is, how many schools are you working with now, John, across the country, across the world? Any idea?
Each year it's about 10,000.
10,000 schools, wow. So yeah, so when we come to scaling, you probably know about as much about it as there is.
Well, I've learned the hard way. Yes, Stephen, it's the hard way, but it's that reminder of what's new. And you're right. It's that silver bullet that we're looking for. It's principals who walk in and say, I did it at that school, it worked, I'm going to do it here. Well, maybe what's here isn't applicable, what's happening. And that's why I think one of the most powerful things you need to do in scaling up is really good diagnosis to make sure you're very clear so that you then build an evaluation cycle. You've got to stop and smell the roses and show back to your teachers it is worth it in terms of the impact on kids, both in terms of their sense of being a learner and, I make no excuse, and on their achievement. It's both those things.
Cool.
Technology's been around, as we know, since the 1970s. Dylan Williams made the comment that it's the revolution that's been coming for the last 50 years. There's been 200 plus meta-analyses on the effect of technology in schools. Very, very low effect sizes. Technology has hardly helped the old grammar of schooling. In the old grammar of schooling, where we as teachers talk a lot, we ask lots of questions, 90% plus of our conversation and our feedback is about the facts, the content. Technology has hardly helped. One of the things that's really quite sensational about the COVID teaching is social media is probably the best thing that's happened in terms of technology and the classroom. Now, I know there's a lot of negatives with social media and Facebook and bullying and all those things. I'm not talking about that. I'm talking about using social media to hear how students are thinking, to hear what students are struggling with, what they know and what they don't understand. I remember the moment for me, an epiphanal moment a few years ago, when Marie Davis was working with this class, trying to get this particular child, a 14-year-old boy, to talk to her about what he knew and he didn't know. He said, "No, I'm okay, miss." And she looked over his shoulder, and there on Edmodo, kind of like Facebook, he was typing out what he didn't understand. And that led us, and Marie and I, to spend a lot more time using social media tools to get kids to think aloud, to talk to each other. I asked you in COVID how you've got to know your students differently through social media compared to in class. In class, they come to hear you talk. Social media, you hear them thinking aloud. And so I think the most exciting thing is to how we can bring back better when we come back to in class, to use a lot of those tools of social media to get kids to talk to each other, to talk to you about what they know and particularly what they don't know. So it can help you better have an impact on understanding where that gap is in terms of their understanding.
So I think one of the elements here is we've almost deconstructed the school day through this kind of experiment and realised that what we've actually set up is because of the structure of the school rather than because of the learning. And this allows us to really rethink the notion of learning and how it can be impactful. And this ties beautifully into the learning strategies because you can start to see them actually happening. Yeah. Cool.
And there's a new word that comes in, Stephen, and you mentioned it before, which you hardly hear in education. Like so often we talk about how effective we're going to be. During COVID days, we're starting to talk about how we can be more efficient. And some students are saying, I can do my whole day's work in about 2 hours. What do I do in the other 3 hours I do at school? Now, I know because of structures, we have them for those 5 hours, but maybe we need to be a little bit more sensitive to saying it's okay to be efficient as well, which again is going to change a lot about how we teach. I think we've got a lot to learn from COVID, but we're going to have to do it together. And this is this notion of collective. How are we going to do it together, particularly as teachers, particularly in COVID times? And it's kind of like when you get on an aeroplane and they do the safety demonstration. The first message is, put your oxygen mask on first. How do we get teachers to work together to enhance their impact and to learn from each other about how they think about their impact, what their expectations are? It's hard work. And the key in collective, both at the teacher level and also at the student level, are these I and we skills, particularly around social sensitivity. Teaching students, and sometimes school leaders, teaching teachers how they can contribute to a group. Have they got the confidence to contribute to the group? And the third one, the one that I find the hardest, do I have the confidence that the group can come up with a better answer than I can? And I'm sure all of you have been in meetings where you think, oh, I could do this so much faster if I did it by myself. Well, that's not conducive to upscaling. It's not conducive to making a collective difference. And so how do we find ways to increase the amount of turn taking in the staff room, turn taking in the classroom? How do we find ways where at the right time we give students and teachers to work together on a task? Sometimes we have to come up with better ways to assess individual and group contribution. And we're spending a lot of time at the moment looking at how we can increase the collective efficacy of students. And there's a lot of people out there looking at the collective efficacy of teachers.
John, sorry, just before you get onto this one, can I just go, because Leithwood came out with this kind of notion from his research that it's hard to lift self-efficacy above collective efficacy. It's the collective that needs to come first. The self follows. And I guess this is the McDonald's model, the Timpson shoe shop model, where they'll take people with quite disadvantaged and often quite challenged. And then because the collective's so strong, they could lift them through that.
Oh, totally. And I think that applies to us all. And that, particularly when you look at what the employers are now asking for, they want team players, they want collaborators, they want communicators. And I would say if I came into your school, would I see kids sitting in groups working alone? Would I see assessments done entirely by individuals? Would I see reporting about individuals and not groups? This is not what employers are asking for now. This is not what your shoe shops and your McDonald's are asking for now. And so we need to come up with better ways to teach the skills of being in the collective. And certainly when we work with schools, how do you build that collective in the staff room? It is so imperative for today's society.
And you're suggesting it doesn't matter if you're in rows because of the COVID and you've got to have the social distancing because you've got the social media, you can have it on at the same time so we can have that collective moving. Yeah, great.
And the last thing I want to mention in this session is sort of to come back to this notion of impact. What's your learner dashboard? What does it mean to be a learner in the school? And we work with you to look at the attributes of what a learner, and every school we work in has slightly different language, how they do it, and that's great. But it is about getting that concept of what it means to be a good learner and how you build that in to the everyday life of the classroom and how you build a dashboard about it. And one part of it, for example, is the Jenkins curve, Lee Jenkins, where he asked students, do you want to come to the school to learn the kind of things we teach at the school? And you can see there the 95% K down to the 40%, the end of primary school, start of secondary school. That's one of my key indicators I want on your learner dashboard. And I want you to build that concept of what it means to be a learner and have that. And that's what's going to drive both the impact, the upscaling, how you get kids to use technology to have better understandings of what it means to be a learner, how we can do this collectively. There's so many exciting things that we can do in the name of knowing thy impact. Stephen.
What we're doing, sorry, I think what we're doing, John, there is we've been working with 8 MATs across the UK, mainly in England initially, and there's about another 20 wanting to come on board with this impact narrative. And what we're doing is developing a survey for schools where they can really look at, well, what are the key components of learning and how their students work on it. And then we're upscaling that work to have a look at, well, what does that create as a narrative and how do we move that and how can we create this really sort of sense of a dashboard. So that's something people can get involved with, and you'll be hearing more about that over this year. And that's with John sitting on with us alongside it.
That's great. Stephen, I'm almost there. I want to finish with a couple of an example. This is an example of a primary school. This is where a group of teachers in grades 1 to 3 across the school have got together at the start of the year and worked out down the side the 13 success criteria they have, in this case, the teaching of reading. But along the bottom are all their students. And what happens is the dark green is the student can do it. The yellow is they can't do it yet. Now, a teacher cannot come in here and just change from dark green to yellow. They have to convince their fellow teachers that this child has, with evidence from the child, that they can actually do these things. And sometimes Grant Smith, who leads the group, will say, no, I want to go and talk with the student to see whether they can really do this. What an incredible way to build a collective about their impact. Stunningly successful school. The work we do the same kind of thing. We have a different color scheme, traffic lights. And here's schools we work with, time 1, the black, and you can see where they go to from red. And we monitor the progress. We have a learner dashboard for teachers. We know, for instance, this is across 300 schools in one country. This is what it was like in year 1. Lots of red, too much red. Year 2, big changes as we focused on the learner. By year 3, we'd got it. Right across that school district. That's only about 10 schools. Each line is a school. There's about 200 in this graph. How are we monitoring it? Now, I don't know many schools who see this kind of improvement, who don't want to do more of it. And that's the best motivator for improving these kinds of notions. So that's my message in this session. Thank you, Steve.
Thanks so much, John, and thanks everyone for joining us. The thing's open. Thank you, Katie, for being there. The line's open if you want to talk more in detail about this and how you can create this in your group of schools and how you can become part of this journey. But thanks so much for your time. Really appreciate it.
Thank you.